pots back onto the fire. How you put stuff back onto the fire. And then there's also hatmona, how you insulate foods. And then there's also how you put up foods from before Shabbos. Those are the rabbinic, right, the Rabbanon restrictions that are for Shabbos. We're not going to get to that tonight, but I don't think. But Be'ez Hashem, they will be discussed. So tonight, again, we're just going to deal with all the basics of Bishul and Shabbos, what you're not allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. So a few things I would not discuss last week, which are really as a hakdama. First of all, it's very important in Hilchos Shabbos to know the difference between what's asur midaraisa, what's asur midarabanan. Meaning, if something's asur midaraisa, then it gives us very little leeway with which to be makel with. If something's derabanan, then we have a lot more leeway to be makel. And then when you have deraisas, you can't use combinations of chumras and kulas to allow things. But when you have derabanans and you start piling up the derabanans, then you can combine them to be more lenient. Not that we're necessarily looking to be lenient, we're looking to do what's proper. But the fact of the matter is that when the Rabbanon are the ones that said something can't be done on Shabbos, then they have a lot more wherewithal and leeway to be more lenient in certain situations. And the reason why that's important, not that there's any difference in Isser levels, if it's a Derabanan or Deraisa. We treat an Isser Derabanan as strict, if not more strict than the Deraisa. It's just in this area where you can combine Yisurim or Heterim in order to allow things. And again, the reminder is that Shabbos the Rabbanon are not there to make our Shabbos more difficult. It's just there to protect us from being Mechal Shabbos on the Torah level, right? That's one. Two is there's something called Meleches Machsheves, which really applies to all mitzvahs, but it really applies specifically to Hilchos Shabbos. Like we said last week, the Lamates Melachos is based on what went on in the Mishkan. When things were done in the Mishkan, they were done conscientiously. I think we discussed this last week, but maybe we didn't discuss it enough. Meaning they did it with a specific purpose in mind. Nothing happened haphazard, and nothing happened just by happenstance. It happened with a specific goal and a specific in a specific way. So therefore, on Shabbos, if we do the malacha differently than it was done in the Mishkan, then even if the end result might be the same, but since it was done in a different way, then it's not going to be asur from the Torah. Maybe asur from the Rabbanon. It's not going to be asur from the Torah. In which case, there's going to be room to be makel, to use combinations of a Torah, right? So the most common of the Meleches Machsheves is if you do something with a shinui, if you do it differently than the way you're supposed to do it, meaning if somebody has to write for a chayla or something on Shabbos, somebody has to write. So we always say write with the left hand and not the right hand, because the left hand is with a shinui. What does a shinui help? The end result is the same. I mean, your handwriting might not be as neat with the left hand as with the right hand, or if you're a lefty, then with the right hand. But the point is the way it's done was not the way things were done in the Mishkan. They didn't do things backhanded in the Mishkan. They did it the way you're supposed to properly do it. So if you do that on Shabbos, then it's going to be a Derabanan. Again, it's still also a Derabanan, but when we deal with the Rabbanans, then there is more room to be lenient. And the reason that it's also important to know what the source is for the things that we do on Shabbos. There's a lot of misunderstanding with a lot of chumras that we keep on Shabbos are exactly that. They're chumras. And people think that they're not chumras, that they're really part of Hilchos Shabbos, which they are. Of course, they are part of Hilchos Shabbos. But if it's a chumrah and then people yell at their family members or get into disagreements about things and they start making complaints against people that are doing things incorrectly, and it becomes a whole family feud. And it's really something that should be avoided, because really it is a chumrah. Sometimes they'll get calls from people and they're saying, like, their kids don't want to do this, don't want to do that. Should they fight them? Should they not fight them? And a lot of times, this is just something that can totally be avoided, because it's just a chumrah that many people misunderstand and think that it is something that's almost the aseret hadibros, and really it's not. So we're going to try and go through those situations. Also, I'm sitting in a kitchen, so we can actually do something hands-on to show exactly what's going on. So maybe it'll make it a little bit confusing, a little less confusing, hopefully not more confusing. If it's more confusing, I'll leave the kitchen. Okay, so now we discussed that there's Bishul. What is the Isser of Bishul? Bishul, baking, whatever it was, that Isser is changing a food through heat. Changing a food through a heat medium is what Bishul does. It actually changes the food, right? So for example, just to bring something up that really doesn't have much practical application, what's a microwave? Is a microwave considered cooking or not? We know that the cooking that was done in the Mishkan was done with fire. Therefore, the only cooking that is really a problem on Shabbos is cooking done through fire. Cooking from the sun is not fire. So you can basically, if you lived in a hot climate, you can take an egg and put it out in the sun. If the sun will cook that egg, then that's perfectly fine. Lichatchila, there's no gezer against that whatsoever. Take your egg, put it out in the sun, and that's fine. Take something that was pre-cooked, put it out in the sun, also okay. You're not allowed to do it though with something that got hot from the sun. That's a gezer d'Rabbanan, meaning if you took something metal, put it out into the sun, let that piece of metal get hot, and then you cook an egg on it, that would not be allowed. But straight on the sun would be allowed. So what about a microwave? Right? Is a microwave considered cooking or not? The way a microwave works is basically the molecules that are inside the foods get agitated by the microwaves, by the waves, and that creates a heat inside the food. That is not from fire. That's not cooking. Well, it's a disagreement whether that's cooking from fire or not. Rabbi Feinstein said that cooking on a microwave is also from the Torah. So you're saying, okay, who's using a microwave anyways? In order to get a microwave to work, you have to press buttons and use electricity. So when would that ever be applicable? The answer is that if never, then we should never know from it. If somebody's sick and they need hot food on Shabbos, is it better to have that food heated up on a fire, or is it better to have that food heated up in a microwave? Because if a microwave is only d'Rabbanan, yes, using the buttons and the electricity is d'Rabbanan, but the cooking from the microwave would also be a d'Rabbanan, then it would be much better for the guy to warm the food up in the microwave, not in an oven. But Ramosha Feinstein paskins that a microwave is considered cooking from the Torah, because he said this, I don't know, 30, it's more than that, probably 60 years ago. I don't remember when the tshuva was dated, but he said that in the future, you're going to see that everybody's going to cook with a microwave. And since that's going to be the regular way to cook, therefore, you're not allowed to cook with a microwave. Shabbos is no different to cooking with a microwave or with an oven or a stovetop, which is interesting because some say that Ramosha Feinstein was a Navi almost, because that's exactly what happens nowadays. Everybody uses microwaves. However, some say that that's not what happened, because nobody actually cooks with microwaves. They just warm things up with microwaves. Most people don't actually cook things with microwaves. But either way, that's what Ramosha Feinstein's tshuva was on that. But the point is that it has to be a bishul the way it was done in the Torah, in the Mishkan. I'm sorry. So, like we started discussing last week, if something's cooked, there's a rule called ein bishul achar bishul. Once something is cooked, it can no longer be chayav for cooking anymore. Right. So, for example, if you have a piece of kugel that was already cooked before Shabbos, then there's no way to be over on an Isser Torah from reheating that kugel. So theoretically, you can just take that kugel, and if your fire is on from before Shabbos, just put it straight onto a fire. The reason why that can't be done which we'll get to Bez Hashem next week, is for the Isser of Chazara, which is you're not allowed to take things and put it down onto fire. Even if the fire was there from before Shabbos, that's an Isser D'Rabbanan, not an Isser from the Torah, having nothing to do with the cooking of the kugel. Right? So anything that was cooked before Shabbos is you're allowed to recook it as long as it meets the D'Rabbanan requirements. Again, we'll keep reminding everybody that besides the Rabbanan requirement, because you have to keep that in mind. Because sometimes you say, okay, so kugel, as it's already cooked before Shabbos, why can't I just put it down right on top of the blech? The answer is you can't do that. Unless, I mean, you could do it if you do it correctly, the way the Rabbanan said, but for an Issa the Rabbanan. But just from the, just from the cooking angle, there is no cooking after cooking. Now, how do you define cooking? Cooking is with liquid. Cooking is anything that you put a liquid in order to cook it, like pasta. Kugel starts off as a liquid. That's considered cooking. Baking is not cooking. Baking is something else. Baking doesn't really have liquid. It's more of a solid. Clich is roasted. That's also not with a liquid. That's something like schnitzel with a very like grilled chicken. Steak that's not cooked. Pepper steak, yes, but pepper steak is in liquid. But anything that's not liquid is called either baking or roasting. Okay, so now why is it so important? Because basically what the halacha is that we said that cooking on Shabbos is changing something through heat, right? Heat meaning heat from fire. So there's no cooking after cooking. So basically, if I took noodles and cooked them before Shabbos and I wanted to put them into a soup, there's going to be no issue. Again, as long as the soup is not on the fire, but that's because of the Rabbanan restriction, not from the Torah. From the Torah, you could take noodles that were pre-cooked, put them straight into a pot of soup that's even on the stove. You're not allowed to do that because of the Rabbanan. I'm sorry to keep reiterating, but we have to just make sure that we know that because of the Issa D'Rabbanan, you can't do that. But once you pour it into a second pot, then you're allowed to do it, which we'll get to. We'll get to that in a few minutes, Bez Hashem. So again, there's no cooking after cooking. What about, is there cooking after baking and roasting? For example, you want to take challah, which is baked, and you want to put it into a soup. Now that, you are changing it, because before it was baked, and now it's going to be cooked, right? Or you want to do the opposite. You want to take something that was cooked and you want to bake it. For example, you want to take noodles that were cooked and you want to put it on a straight fire in order to crisp them, to make them crisp. So you would put them, I don't know if anybody actually does something like that. I'm just using it as an example, right? So that's something that you would be roasting or barbecuing or baking after cooking. That's a big disagreement in the Poskim, whether we say that or not. The two sides to that are, if you cook something, then changing it to baked is actually changing something, right? When you cook kugel and then you reheat it, you're not doing anything. You're just making it from cold to warm. You're not changing anything about the kugel, right? When you take something that's roasted and you re-roast it, you're also not changing anything. When you take something that's baked and you're baking it again, then that's also, you're not really changing anything in the form of the food. But if you take something baked and you're making it cooked, or you take something cooked and you're making it baked, then that's considered changing. That's the reason why some say you're not allowed to do it. Others say no. Once it's ready, and you don't have to differentiate. We paskin l'maisa l'chumra on both, and you're not supposed to bake after something that's cooked, and you're not supposed to cook something after it's baked. But we'll see that that's for sure the Rabbanon, and we're going to use that with a combination of other things to allow certain things on Shabbos, which many people get confused with. Okay? If something gets baked and then cooked, so then we always give it the latter status, not the former. Meaning, if it started off baked and then you cooked it, I'm not thinking of examples right now. If somebody has an example, they could post it. Or if you baked something and then you decided to cook it, then it's always going to retain its later status. I guess maybe matzah brai or something like that. If it was baked and you cooked it together with liquid, then that would be considered. It always takes the later status. Okay, so now so this is something that we discussed last week, and I just want to reiterate it. What do you look at? How do you look at fats, congealed fats, butter? Let's say butter, meats that have congealed fats, chickens that have congealed fats. I know there was a lot of questions about that last week. Do we look at that as a liquid, or do we look at that as a solid? Okay, just before that, let me just back up one more second. I just want to review something we did last week. Is that Ein Bishul Acher Bishul goes on solids. On liquids is a big disagreement whether we say that there's no cooking after cooking. Meaning, if you have a soup that was pre-cooked before Shabbos, and now you want to recook it on Shabbos using the ways that are allowed, is that Ein Bishul Acher Bishul or not? Okay, I hope I'm not being so technical here. I was trying to think of ways to make this a little bit more exciting. Being in the kitchen, hopefully in a few minutes, maybe make it a little more exciting. But I hope I'm not being a little dry, not trying, no pun intended with that. But liquids being recooked after liquids is a big disagreement. So again, like a soup or a coffee that was hot before Shabbos, cooked before Shabbos, then you want to recook it on Shabbos. Is that allowed or not? We paskin, Svardim paskin, that it's not allowed. We say that there is bishul after bishul by liquids. And the reason for that is because they say, well, something that's cold doesn't taste nearly as good as when it's hot. Right? Meaning a cold piece of chicken, a cold piece of meat, you like it warmer. So then, okay, that's not a major improvement. Many people will eat chicken cold, or kugel cold, or whatever it is. May not enjoy it as much as it's warm, or hot, but it's edible. But okay, now that cold coffee, maybe that changed. Iced coffee maybe changed things. But most people like their coffee hot, and if it's cold, they don't like it. Soup for sure. So therefore, those pais can say that there is an improvement by liquids. When it's cold and you reheat it, that's considered a major improvement. Therefore, you're not allowed to reheat it on Shabbos. And others say, no, it was already cooked, and you're just putting it back to its original status, and therefore it's not a problem. Ashkenazim, Sfardim hold me'ikar adin, you are not allowed to. There's bishul acher bishul by liquid. Ashkenazim really hold, according to most, hold that you are allowed to reheat cooked foods, but we don't do it as a chumrah. Like we said before, not doing something as a chumrah can play a major role in the practical applications of reheating cooked food. So the bottom line is congealed fats that are on the chicken, that are on the meat, or butter. I think those are the basic examples. So do we look at that like it's a solid or that's a liquid? Right now it's a solid, right? It's congealed fat, it's solid. If you heat it up, it's going to become liquid. So most places can say that the fats are considered solid. That's the way we paskin. Fats are considered solid. So when you're reheating chicken, meat, vegetables, whatever that have that get like a layer of oil that's congealed, we look at it that, well, oil doesn't congeal, then it's obviously liquid. But when it's congealed fat, then we look at it like it is a dry food, and therefore there is no restriction of reheating it on Shabbos. Now, the reason why this gets confusing is because you are not allowed to take fats and then melt it down till they're totally liquid. That has nothing to do with cooking. That's not an issue for cooking. That's an issue because you're creating a new entity, right? It was a solid, now it's a liquid. But if you do that and it melts into food, then that's not an issue. Okay, so therefore, if you're taking out your food from the refrigerator, that's the chicken that has congealed fats, or meat that has congealed fat, and you put it down on something to warm it up, if you do it the proper way, which Bez Hashem will get to, if you do it the proper way, the way it's allowed on Shabbos, then then you are allowed to heat it up that way. And even if it becomes totally liquid, since the liquid goes into the food, then it's okay. Okay, many people don't understand that. But that would be okay only because it's going into the food. And that we said last week also with the souffles and the cookies that have melted chocolate. If the chocolate's being melted and it's going straight into the cookie, then that's perfectly fine to do on Shabbos. Okay, but again, so everybody's worried about how much congealed fat that's on chicken is allowed to be warmed up. The bottom line is it's allowed to be warmed up if it goes, because it goes into, it's looked at a salad, right? There's no bishul achar bishul, and it goes straight into the food. Okay. Independent sauce, warming up sauce by itself, like hot, how do you call it? Hot sauce. How's it go? Hot sauce for chicken. What do you call it? Poppers, right? So a lot of people take schnitzel and then they want to add popper sauce. So if the popper sauce is congealed, which I don't think it gets to, but let's say it does, it gets totally congealed, you cannot get it melted down separately. You have to pour it onto the chicken first, and then let it congeal into let it melt. The congeal should melt straight into the chicken, and then it's going to be allowed. Okay, so I hope we're clear with that. And again, just to reiterate, warming something up on Shabbos, if that food cannot get to a temperature of 110 degrees, then it's perfectly mutter lichatchila to warm that up if you do it properly, right? For example, if you put it down on top of if you take your chicken with the sauce, meat with the sauce, and you put it down on top of your crock pot, then that's perfectly mutter lichatchila to do if it can't get to 110 degrees. If it'll take 24 hours for it to get to 110 degrees, then lichatchila you shouldn't put it there. But if you did put it there, then it's going to be okay. It's not going to make the food usher. Again, so Shabbos morning, you want to take the chicken or the meat out of the refrigerator and put it down on top of, let's go, if you use a hot plate, if you hold it, a hot plate is allowed to be used on Shabbos, which is a big disagreement, which we'll get to as Hashem. But let's say you hold it, you can put it on a hot plate. So you take it out of the refrigerator, right? And that's a solid food. So I'm sorry, that's a bad example. That's perfectly fine to put down because it's ein bishul achar bishul, and even if it's going to get higher to 110 degrees, that's no problem. But let's say something liquidy. You want to warm up a liquid like a soup, or whatever it is, and you want to put it down on a hot plate. Okay, now if you have to experiment with the hot plate, the basic way to do it is experiment. I don't think you need to keep it on there for 24 hours. But if you put the soup onto the hot plate and after 5-6 hours, you feel the soup and the soup does not get hotter than 110 degrees, which is pretty hot, then you can lichatchila warm up liquids. It's no problem. Okay, it's because since it does not have the ability to get to higher 110 degrees, then there is no issue of warming up liquids. Okay, I hope I'm being clear with that. There's a lot of misunderstanding with that. But again, the reason that if it could potentially get to 110 degrees, then the Chachamim said not to do it because we're afraid you're going to leave it there and then the liquid's going to get to 110 degrees, which we said already, that we say that you're not supposed to reheat liquid that was cold. Okay, if the liquid is warmer than room temperature, it's better to keep it a little warmer than that. Let's say 100 degrees. If that liquid is still 100 degrees, then Ashkenazim will hold that you can reheat that to whatever temperature you want. Okay, so basically that's why people with the tea scents, those that make tea scents, so what they do is they keep it a little warm, and then they don't have any issues of putting it into a Clich, Clicheni, which we're going to get to in a minute. So they have no issues because as long as the liquid is warmer than room temperature, and really it should be a little warmer than that because room temperature is 70 degrees. So meaning the best way to do it is if it's not cold enough that somebody would say, oh, this is not edible because it's too cold, meaning like a soup or a tea, right? And people don't want it because they want to have it warm. So warm, they'll have it. If it's anything colder than warm, which is no specific amount, It's a little bit subjective. But I would say in the area of 90 degrees, 100 degrees, in that area, that would be okay to reheat it up to 1,000 degrees. That's no problem. I hope we're being clear with this. I'm just going to repeat it. I hope I'm not boring you, but just to make sure we have it clear, liquids that are cold, we paskin lechatchila cannot be reheated on Shabbos. If the liquid is warmer than room temperature, then that can be reheated on Shabbos. And any liquid that's not going to get to 110 degrees is allowed to be reheated on Shabbos to whatever temperature that you want. For Ashkenazim, Sfardim, it's a problem. Ashkenazim, as long as it's warmer than room temperature, you can take that liquid and reheat it. Okay, fine. So now let's get to Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, Kli Shlishi, because I think there's a lot of confusion with that. For those that don't drink coffee and teas, it might be a little bit boring here, but most people do. If they don't drink it themselves, then they make it for others. So that's why it's important. So first thing is, and somebody actually asked this to me on Friday, you get these new types of urns that have Shabbos mode on it. It says Sabbath mode, then some have Yom Tov mode even, right? So this fellow, I don't know who it was, but whoever it was that texted me, wanted to know, if it's on Sabbath mode, so I could do whatever I want. I can make tea without Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni. I could do whatever I want. That's not the case. That's not what a Sabbath mode. And the same with the ovens, which we'll get to also, the confusion with the Sabbath mode ovens. But Yom Tov mode and Sabbath mode. Basically, what Sabbath mode on an urn does is some poskim, again, not all, say, well, if your water the way an urn works is that gets up to a temperature of, let's say, 200 degrees or 185 degrees, whatever it is, and then it cools off, and then the thermostat senses that it's going to get colder, and then it reheats the water, right? Now, what's going to happen is, if you take out water, then that might drop the temperature, and then that's going to cause the urn to turn on. Okay, we're going to get to this when we discuss opening oven doors and opening refrigerators and all that. But that's what that Shabbos mode is all about. So what that does is that the Sabbath mode on an urn takes off that I don't know if it takes off the thermostat exactly, but whatever it does, that takes care of that issue, which not everybody has an issue with that anyways. Okay, so that's the first thing. So you don't have to go out and buy an urn that has a Sabbath mode. That's for sure. Yeah, okay. So I'm just looking at some questions here. Yeah, so congealed sauce and congealed fat, I'm sorry, is the same. It would be the same thing as long as it's congealed. Right? I don't know how you measure 110 degrees. You feel it. If you can feel it, then you're certainly going to be okay. Just notice that why we don't need the Sabbath mode one is because you have no idea if you're going to set off that thermostat or not. Since you have no idea, then that's not the malacha like we discussed in the Mishkan. It has to be a malacha that you know exactly what you're doing. So since you have no idea if you taking the water is going to set off the thermostat, so therefore it's okay. Sort of the same thing with why you're allowed to open a refrigerator door on Shabbos, which we'll Hashem get to in future weeks. Okay. So now let's talk about Kli Rishon. So a Kli Rishon cooks everything, right? When a Kli Rishon means the utensil that is on the fire. It doesn't have to be on the fire, meaning it's the utensil that the food was initially cooked in, meaning a chicken soup that you put in a pot, right? That pot is Kli Rishon. Even when you remove it from the fire, that has a status of Kli Rishon, and that will cook anything. We believe that a Kli Rishon, again, obviously, if it's above 110 degrees, anything lower than 110 degrees cannot cook. Okay, that's considered cold in halacha, which, by the way, for kashrus is the same thing. You get questions all the time. I had my warm chicken, touched the dairy spoon. If all you're going to say that it's warm, which means that it's less than 110 degrees, it cannot transfer taste whatsoever, and therefore it's good. You don't even have to ask a shaila. I mean, you're welcome to ask the shaila, but you can even have warm meat, warm, meaning 109 degrees, which is pretty hot. Obviously, you're not going to know it's exactly 109 degrees or not, but you can take warm meat or even relatively hot meat that touches a hot piece of cheese. Again, less than 110 degrees, it's no problem. Now, we tell you to rinse it because we're just afraid that some particles of the meat got onto the cheese or some particles of cheese got onto the meat. So you rinse it, right? If you can't rinse it, then you ask a shaila. But if it's anything less than 110 degrees, even in kashrus, it can do nothing. Anything less than 110 degrees will not transfer any sort of taste. So anyway, so a kli rishon. Yeah, so a kli rishon is the pot that the food was initially cooked in, even when it's removed from the fire. For all intents and practical purposes, there's no difference between a kli rishon on the fire, not on the fire. You're not allowed to put anything into it because it's going to fully cook it. Okay. After that comes irui of a kli rishon, pouring of a kli rishon. When you take something from a kli and you pour it into another kli, so if that pour hits something, then that's called irui of a kli rishon. The halacha with that is that it only cooks a klipa, which is just a very slim layer of whatever food that you're pouring it onto. Okay, so that's that would be an irui, which is why when you want to make a coffee or whatever it is that you're pouring water onto, you should not put the coffee into the cup. What you do, and then pour the hot water from the kli rishon. What you do is you put in the water into the second kli, to the next kli, which we'll do that hands-on in a minute, and then then you add the coffee. Okay, so again, there's kli rishon, and then there's pouring of a kli rishon, which, by the way, in liquids, there's no such thing as a layer of liquid. So if you take something from a kli rishon and you pour it onto a liquid, there's no layers. So therefore, that would be okay. We look at that like a kli sheni. Then you have kli sheni, the second kli. So the second kli does not cook. We paskin that something in a kli sheni cannot cook anything. Doesn't matter what the temperature is. And the reason for that is because the walls of the kli sheni are cold, and the walls cool off the hot water. Okay. So when the walls cool off the hot water, it drops the intensity of the heat, which to our minds may seem a little bit confusing, because basically you can have a kli rishon that's on the fire, right? That's 200 degrees, whatever it is. You take it off the fire, 15, 20 minutes later, probably the temperature will drop down to 100. Let's say it drops down to 130 degrees. If you put something in there to cook, that's going to be also, because that's cooking on a kli rishon. You take a kli sheni, right? Basically, you take from this pot, you pour it into a pot next to it, and now the temperature in the second pot is 160 degrees. Then that second pot will not cook, even though that second pot is 40 degrees hotter than the first pot. Right? Because the reason is we have to believe in the Chachamim. The Chachamim are the ones that discovered the science of this, and they said once the walls of another pot, which were cold, hits the water, that's cooling off your water, and it no longer can cook. Okay, and that's only because the kli sheni, the walls of the kli sheni, are cold, and therefore it cools off the intensity of the heat. So basically, you can have in a kli rishon, the pot that the food was initially cooked in, and let's say it's 120 degrees, and you have a kli sheni that the cooked food was poured into the second kli, and that is 150 degrees. Then cooking in the second pot is not a problem. The kli sheni is not a problem, even though it's 30 degrees hotter than the first pot. That is. That's what the Chachamim said, and that's the way we paskin. Even though to our brains it may not make any sense. How could something that's 150 degrees cook less than something that's 110, 120 degrees? Right? So the only problem, so what's everybody saying with the Clich? So the problem with the Clich is that there are certain things that can be used that can cook in a Clich, and that's called Kalia Bishul. Things that are very lightly, that cook very easily, can be cooked in a Clich. The problem is that we have already lost, not just in America. It was lost already hundreds of years ago, exactly what's considered Klirisha, what's considered easily cooked and what's not considered easily cooked. Therefore, we try and avoid putting anything into a Clich. Okay. However, something that's already pre-cooked, right, can be added to a Clich, because it's Bishul Achar Bishul, and we're not really so worried about it. Meaning, even those that don't do Bishul Achar Bishul on liquids, that's a Chumrah, right? So it was already pre-cooked, and also water cannot cook in a Clich. So therefore, if you want to make a coffee, all you need to do is use a Clich, and not a coffee. You want to add cold water to a Clich. So then all you need is for sure a Clich, and then you're okay. Now, before we continue with that, what is a Kli Rishon and what is a Clich? So for this, I hope everybody can see. Somebody to, you can, have somebody hold it. Okay, now this here is, we have two. No, you're gonna go back because I'm gonna see it. Sorry. Can you see it? No. Yeah. Okay, we have two examples of a Kli Rishon and two Kli Rishons. This would be a classic Kli Rishon. That's your urn. This is a pot of soup. That is also a Kli Rishon. Now, if you wanted to make a coffee, so we take a hot cup and you let in hot water into the cup. Right now, since the walls of this hot cup is cool or cold, it now cooled off. This is a Clich. This was a Kli Rishon. This is now a Clich, and therefore, this can no longer have the ability to cook unless it's something what we call Kalia Bishul, right? So therefore, you that's all you need to make Clich. You want now, because we say we don't know, some things can cook a Clich, some things can't. So then you want to use a Kli Shlishi. So then you pour it from there to there. That's now a Kli Shlishi according to all opinions. You don't need to do more than that. Many people confuse and they say that the initial cup is the Kli Rishon, and then you pour it into there. That's the Clich, and then you need another cup. That is not the halacha. I know it's a little late, but just there is one opinion that says that this would be considered a Kli Rishon. I'll just explain why. It's interesting why we don't paskin like this. The Chazon Ish says that when you let water in, so since the water is hitting the pot, it's still on the flame, I hope you can see that, right? The water is still on the flame that's in there. So once it's on the flame and it hits the Clich, Chazon Ish says, since it was connected to the heat source, that's a Kli Rishon. This would be a Kli Rishon, right? So that's his opinion. We don't paskin like that. So what would be a way out of that is if you would let in the water like this, right? You put it, and nobody should do this practically. I mean, you could if you want, but just to explain the difference, what would be if the water detaches from the heat source before it hits the Clich, then everybody would hold it as a Clich. So that would be sort of like doing this, where it detached from here before it actually hit the pot. Well, again, we don't paskin like that. So, but some people think that you need to use multiple utensils. That's not the case. That's not the way we paskin. So again, this is a Kli Rishon. This is a Clich. Pour it into a cup. That would be a Kli Shlishi. Let's say using a pot on an oven. All right, this would be a pot that's on an oven. So you take this, and then now this is the interesting question that I know many people have wanted to know. So now you take this and you pour it. If you would pour it into here like that, that would be, this is the Kli Rishon. Let's say this would be a bowl. This is going to be a Clich. What about a ladle? Okay, now a ladle is a utensil unto itself, right? That ladle, and you would take it and pour it into here like that. So now, what would that be? Does this ladle become a Clich sheni, and then this becomes a Clich shlishi, or does this, because it's been sitting in the soup pot the whole time, maybe this is looked at as a Clich rishon and then a Clich sheni, which we'll get to the practical application in a minute. Okay, so again, the question that the Pais can say is, this ladle considered a Clich rishon because since it sits in the pot, it retains the same level of the pot, or do we say no, it's a separate utensil, so then it's a Clich sheni, and then this would already be a Clich shlishi. Okay, now what would the difference be? The difference would be is people want to put in croutons into their soups, right? So when you want to put in a crouton into the soup, croutons are, if they're baked, if the crouton is baked, right, then we said there's Bishul achar afiyah. Lichatchila, we say that there is cooking after baking. So you would need to use you would want to use a Clich shlishi. You'd want to use a Clich shlishi in order to put in your croutons, and you have no shaila because the Clich shlishi is really not going to be considered cooking. So what we say is that on this, for that, since it's a chumrah, again, remember we said at the beginning that we can use combinations of heterim. So again, there's a machlokes whether this is considered a Clich sheni and then this is a Clich shlishi. We also have a machlokes whether you're allowed to cook something after baking. So a crouton is baked, which although a lot of croutons, by the way, are cooked, if they're cooked in oil, it's considered cooked, and you could even put it into a Clich sheni. But assuming that we're talking about croutons that were baked, so since we have two Isurei D'Rabbanan, one is that whether you need a Clich shlishi at all, maybe a Clich sheni is enough, and the ladle is many say, and we pass like this, that the ladle is a Clich sheni, and then there's a Clich shlishi. So then basically you would be able to scoop out the soup with the ladle, put it into the bowl, and then you'd have no problem putting in croutons. And challah, what about dipping challah into soup? Challah is baked, right? And soup is cooked, so you're baking the challah. So if you say that this is only a Clich sheni, then you have a problem putting in the challah, dipping in the challah into soup. But the way we paskin is because challah is baked and it's a chumrah to cook challah after it's baked, so therefore we would say that we are going to consider this a Clich sheni, and the bowl of soup is a Clich shlishi, and you're allowed to dip challah into it, you're allowed to put croutons, so you can put whatever you want into it. Whether you're allowed to take soup when it's on the fire will be discussed, hopefully, Be'ez Hashem, next week. Soup, really, you are allowed to take, just as a heads up. Soup can be taken when it's on the fire because it's a liquid, but we'll get to that. Okay, so I hope we're being a little clear with that. Now, okay, so now I think we can sit back down here. I know I'm just going to go a couple of more minutes just to make sure that we have clarity on this. Coffees, like we said, instant coffee, according to most instant coffee was cooked already, right? That was cooked. So therefore, instant coffee can really go into a Clich rishon because it's considered dry, right? And we said dry is allowed to be cooked whenever dried is ain't bishul achar bishul, and you can make dry cooked again. So instant coffee is already pre-cooked. You don't even need a Clich sheni, a Clich shlishi, right? But you can even put into a Clich rishon. The reason why we don't put into a Clich rishon because the Clich rishon usually is on the fire, and that's a different issue. That's an issur d'Rabbanan, which Be'ez Hashem we're going to discuss next week. But theoretically, you can take instant coffee, put it straight into a Clich rishon. Some say to use a Clich sheni because since the instant coffee immediately becomes liquid, so we look at it like a liquid. So therefore, you should use a Clich sheni. Interesting enough, Rabbi Feinstein writes that a Clich shlishi, he always used the Clich shlishi, which is what many people have adopted. Even though with coffee, like we just said, you don't need a Clich shlishi, but it's safer to use a Clich shlishi. But one thing is for sure, like we just showed, 2 cups is enough for a Clich shlishi. The urn is 1, or the pot is 1. The first cup is the Clich sheni, and then the second cup is the Clich shlishi. Also, by the way, you don't need irui of a Clich sheni, meaning pouring from a Clich sheni to a Clich shlishi is not, there's no issue with that. So you can put the coffee into the cup in the Clich shlishi first and then pour on top of it. Now, tea is, there's a big disagreement whether you're allowed to put tea even into a Clich shlishi. The Mishnah Berurah didn't like it. He felt that you're not allowed to put tea leaves because they cook so easily. They even a Clich shlishi, Clich revi, Clich chamishi, it's gonna cook, which is why many people make the tea sense, tea essence, whatever it is. Rabbi Feinstein disagreed with that, and he said that there is no issue putting tea into a Clich shlishi. So what I personally tell people is, if you want to be lenient like Rabbi, it's fine. But if you want to be somewhere in the middle, so just cool down, put it into a Clich shlishi, and then you can pour it back and forth for a minute, and then that will certainly cool it off to, may not get it down to 110 degrees, but there are many poskim that say 120 is considered cold, and some say even more than that. So with all the combinations of heterim, you'd be able to do that. Now, Turkish coffee, which is not such an American thing, or the Starbucks Via, which I think we discussed last week, which some say has roasted coffee in there. So roasted coffee, like we said before, that's afia, that's baked. That's an issue because we said that lichatchila, we don't want to bake. We don't want to cook something after being baked, right? So the question is, what about in the Clich shlishi? Like we said, we just got finished saying that the Clich shlishi would allow you to put challah into it and croutons that were baked. So baked, if you go with those opinions, which is what we paskin, taking baked or roasted coffee that was pre-roasted, you would be allowed to add into a Clich shlishi, which we discussed last week, making the Melita coffees, which is really a butter issue, so we're not going to discuss it now. But bottom line is roasted coffee, me'ikra, then you are allowed to put into a Clich shlishi. So the tea essence that's cold, so if it's cold, then you would need to put it into a Clich sheni, because we said water you can cook cold water is allowed to be cooked in a Clich sheni. Again, many people use a Clich shlishi, but tea essence, if it's cold, you're allowed to add it to a Clich sheni. Safer to use a Clich shlishi. If you keep the tea essence near the crock pot so that it's a little warmer, then you could just add that straight into a Clich rishon, and that would be that. There's one other thing that you wanted to know. Okay, so I just noticed flashing something about the tea essence. So some people the reason why they make tea essence is because they don't want to put tea into a Clich shlishi because tea gets cooked so easily. So what people do is they make a concentrated tea, which is a liquid that can get added. So therefore it's just, but as long as it's, again, if it's warmer than room temperature, then you're allowed to add it even to a Clich rishon, which we don't do because it's on the fire, or you can add it onto a Clich sheni. Okay. Now there's something also called davar gush, just to use another example, and then we'll do all the questions. Okay. To use another example is davar gush is something solid. Okay, something that's solid. Some say that something solid is a Clich rishon, even if you took it off the fire and you rolled it on the ground or whatever it is, it's considered a Clich rishon and it can cook. Okay, so sort of like a potato from the cholent. And you take a potato from the cholent, even though you put it onto a serving bowl, and then you put it onto a plate, and then you took it on that plate, put it onto another plate. Some say that that's still considered a Clich rishon, in which case anything that's not cooked can't be added to that. That's called davar gush. That is a chumrah. Not everybody agrees to it. And if that davar gush is inside liquid, which cholent is a lot, very often cholent is inside other liquid, so therefore you don't have that chumrah. But lechatchila, we do say that. So now those that like to add ketchup to their cholent, can they put ketchup, which is a liquid, right? Ketchup is a liquid, and that's cool, right? So we said that you're not allowed to reheat that. Can you add your ketchup on top of a potato on on Shabbos? Or what about, and the chumrah that people get nervous with is, can they, let's say they put coleslaw on the same plate or salads on the same plate, they put their cholent, and then they put their potatoes onto the liquid. So maybe that's going to cook the liquids. So that's a chumrah. It's a major chumrah. If you keep that, if you know that you choose to be machmir like that, that's fine. But with ketchup, it's interesting because we know that heating up a liquid that's already cold is a machlokes, and whether this davar gush, this solid, is considered a kli rishon, it's also a machlokes. So the poskim can say that to add a ketchup, which is a liquid, to a potato, which is a solid, but it's a chumrah, meaning they're both chumras, so then you can combine those two and you are allowed to add ketchup to a potato or a piece of meat or anything like that, because it's two chumras, and we don't have to combine chumras in order to make something awesome. Okay, so that would be that for tonight. Now there's a lot of questions, so I'm going to stay on here and go through some of the questions. If you want to stay on, visit the hate. If not, I'm going to work from the bottom up. Oh, milk. Okay, yes, I meant to discuss that. Can you add hot water into a cold bottle of milk? So you can add a cold water into a bottle of I'm not sure if this is adding cold milk into hot water or this is adding hot water into a bottle of milk. Either way, if the end result of your mixture is going to be less than 110 degrees, then that's absolutely not a problem, even from a kli rishon, because that's not considered cooked. If you're going to add a ton of hot water and there's very little milk, then, well, the truth is, I'm sorry, milk is no problem. Milk is considered, we said this last week, milk is pasteurized, so milk was already cooked. So a kli sheni for sure, it's no problem, and then you could add it to whatever you want to add, a little milk, a lot of milk, whichever is, as long as it's a kli sheni. A kli rishon you wouldn't be able to do, because we're machmir that liquids that were pre-cooked shouldn't be warmed up again. If you want to do it in a kli rishon, which I don't even see practically why anybody would want to, then you, as long as your end result of the mixture is less than 110 degrees, then it's fine. Okay, so basically, if you wanted to heat up a bottle of milk, just use a kli sheni, just put it into 1 cup, and then you pour it into the bottle, and you're fine, whichever combination it is. Okay. You want to add more hot water to the tea, to the tea essence. Yes, that would be allowed, because that tea bag has already been pre-cooked. Since it's been pre-cooked, that would be allowed, because it would see that's a solid and it's ain't bishul acher bishul. Right? Can you add not cooked spices to a bowl of soup? That's on a kli. If you're using a kli shlishi, then yes, you can. If it's not a kli shlishi, it's only kli sheni, then it would be a problem. But again, it's almost impossible to serve a soup that's not a kli shlishi, like we said before. With the ladle is going to be considered a kli sheni, and then putting into the soup is a kli shlishi. Unless I forgot to mention this, I think I forgot to mention this. If you leave the ladle in there in the soup, which many people do for a long time, then it's already, maybe it gets the status of a kli rishon. So if you want to do that, then don't leave the ladle in the soup. Put it down next to it. Oh, so that was something we discussed last week, and let's just reiterate it this week. Many people get very nervous because they take the reason why they don't want to take the ladle out of the soup is because then they're reheating the water, the liquid that's left on the ladle. That's not a problem as long as the soup that's on the ladle is warmer than room temperature. You can put it back into the pot, right? The only issue that and this is where the confusion sets in, is let's say you wash the ladle with cold water that was never cooked. Then in that situation, you should dry the ladle. If you didn't, it's not a problem. People think that it's mamish also from the Torah to take that water with cold water on a ladle and put it into a hot soup. No, because like we said at the beginning, anything unintended is again, you shouldn't do it lichatchila, but if it was unintended, it's not a problem. Nobody wants to be putting cold water into their soup. If anything, you don't want it. So you try and dry it. If you can't dry it, it's not a big deal. Just shake it. You just shake it off. But certainly with the soup that's left over on the ladle, or cholent's already pre-cooked, you can put that stuff you can put it right back into the soup without having to dry it off in between each time. Only time you should you should be makbid to dry it off is if you washed it with cold water, then you should try and dry it off. You want to know about putting instant coffee into the first cup. Putting coffee into the first cup. I'm not sure. The first cup is instant coffee can go into 1 cup. Yes, 100%. You can even put the coffee into the cup and pour the hot water on top of that. But for Bishul purposes, it's better, it's safer just to put it into a second cup. There's absolutely no reason to use a third cup for instant coffee. Okay, the tea bag on Shabbos, according to the Mishnah Brura, you should not use a tea bag on Shabbos if the water is still hot. It doesn't make a difference if it's in the 3rd Clich, 4th Clich, 5th Clich. The Mishnah Brura doesn't like it because he says tea bags cook extremely fast. Rav Moshe Feinstein disagreed with that. So many are lenient like Rav Moshe Feinstein. But I was saying practically, if you want to be machmer, so then put it into a 3rd cup. Let's say you forgot to make tea essence, or you would like to be lenient and just make the tea with the tea bag. Just let the water cool off for a little bit, or drop a piece of ice in that cools it down, and then it doesn't have to be all the way down to 110. And then you can certainly make tea that way. Can you put coffee creamer into coffee in the Clich? Coffee creamer, I think, is cooked. Coffee creamer, as far as I know, has already been cooked. So since it's been cooked, you would be able to put into a Clich. If it's not cooked, then you should. Well, the truth is, even if it's not cooked, it's a liquid. So then maybe you could be able to put into a Clich also. That's the truth. But use a Clich for sure is enough. A rubber ladle versus a metal ladle is better because it doesn't conduct heat, so it's not going to get hot. So yes, a rubber ladle for sure would be considered a Clich. I don't know what a Yeti cup is. I don't know what that is, but it doesn't make a difference. Even if you put into a thermos or a hot cup, it's still considered. There is an opinion out there that a hot cup is not a Clich, but that's not what we paskin. Even if you put hot water into a thermos in a Clich, that's still considered Clich, even though a thermos is supposed to heat up, keep the water, and maintain the heat. It doesn't make a difference. When it hits that thermos, the walls of the thermos are cool, and it cools down the intensity of the heat. Okay. Also putting meat that's very rare and putting it onto a blech that it's going to get more cooked is really not such a simple. It's not simple at all. It's really better not to do that. So, we'll discuss that in the future. You can take any ice and put it into any bowl of soup, no problem. Even into a klirishin, which you're not going to have. But yes, putting ice into soup is absolutely not a problem. Okay. Just trying to go back into the croutons we discussed. Yeah, separate sauce. Yeah, you should not heat up a separate sauce if it's going to get hotter than 110 degrees, because that's reheating it. But the simple eights of that is for those that want to add sauce into their food, but right before the meal. So what you do is you keep the sauce warm a whole Friday night. Let's say you want it for Shabbos day. You keep the sauce near the cholent pot or near the soup, whatever it is, that it stays warmer than room temperature. Then you have no problem. Then you could heat it up to as hot as you want on Shabbos day. Yes, you could add ice into a bowl of soup. That's not a problem. Okay, let me just check to see any more questions. Again, if there's any questions, just keep posting them, and then I'll get an email and try and discuss it. Really, you could put ice into a klirishin because ice is considered like water, but the truth is it's better not to. It's better not to put ice into a klirishin. It should be put into a klisheni. A klisheni would be okay. I don't know exactly what the practical applications of putting it. You can't put it into a klirishin if it's on the fire. Maybe if it's off the fire, then maybe there's what to talk about, but certainly better not to. I'm sorry if I said that you could do it to klirishin, then that was a mistake. Okay, I think that's it for tonight. I'm sorry if I kept you a little longer. Taking eggs out of the cholent before the meal will be discussed next week. Hot chocolate is like coffee. Taking the eggs out of the cholent, you can if you do it properly. Hot chocolate, if it's pre-cooked, is like coffee. Okay, I wish everybody a good week, and hopefully next week, Bez Hashem, we'll have somebody from the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim giving this shir and not me. But if Mashiach doesn't come, then we'll continue next week, Bez Hashem. Good luck.